Okay, so the next section of your work is on antivirals, and this has probably become much more important this year than it was previously. So previously, the most important antivirals we dealt with was the antiretrovirals, so our drugs against HIV. But now with the corona outbreak, things are probably going to change fast. To put it into perspective, I think 70,000 people around thereabouts die of HIV every year, and we have about 350, 60,000 deaths of coronavirus at the moment. Oh, and that 70,000 is only in South Africa. So, but I mean, generally speaking, the corona has surpassed HIV in a much, much shorter space of time, so it's definitely much more serious. And simply because it spreads much faster. It's not more deadly than HIV. Yes and no. Not as simple as that to just say it that way, but yes and no. Okay. So what we're gonna be going into all of the antivirals that are important in South Africa, and a lot of the broader understanding of antivirals we have to a certain extent done in HIV. So you already have quite a good idea how a virus actually works, but first we have to kind of understand what a virus actually is. We already kind of do, but we'll go into a little bit more detail. So before I go too far, I just want to give you this broad summary here, or this broad table. You don't have to study this at all. There's no point in studying it. But I just want you to see how many viruses we actually know about in the world. And even though this might actually seem like a lot, the estimation is that we only know about 0.1% of all antimicrobials, microbes, so meaning bacteria, viruses, funguses, etc. So we don't even know nearly everything that's out there. And to give you an idea, the coronavirus falls into this class here. If I can just read it, where I can't remember what it. I have the word somewhere in there, but it's something I can't say the word. But coronaviruses generally fall into that class there, and there are about 7 known to infect humans at the moment. 4 of them just give you normal common cold, and the rest of them, well, the rest of them was SARS, MERS, and now it's Corona, COVID-19. So yeah, we had coronaviruses from the start. This one is just the latest version or the newest version. They jump over from animals into humans. And even with the entire thing unfolding now, the coronavirus, somewhere in the world there might be viruses jumping over into humans right now. So it was always inevitable to a certain extent. Okay, but I want you to understand like how many there are. So how little we actually do know about viruses, and how many we actually have to deal with. And then let's get started. So you guys already know this to a very good extent of the HIV, but you know that viruses on their own are useless. They're not actually living things on their own. So there's always a bit of a debate around if they're living or not living. But to be a living organism, you need to be able to reproduce. You need to be able to undergo a few metabolic processes. And the viruses themselves have no metabolic processes. They're just a bunch of proteins mashed together, not mashed together, ordered together in such a way that they can actually invade a cell. But generally speaking, they invade a cell by seeming as something that the cell needs to take up. So they use cell's own receptors against them. So with HIV, it was the CD4 receptor. Now with coronavirus, it seems like it's the ACE enzyme 2 receptor that's on the surface of a bunch of your endothelial cells. Endothelial cells, pneumocytes, meaning your lung cells, we've got 2 types of pneumocytes, the epithelial cells, the cellular epithelial cells, and we've got alveolar epithelial cells. I'm not 100% sure if I have the right one. Easiest way is pneumocytes 1 and pneumocytes 2. So one of them is actually involved with gas exchange, so changing oxygen to CO2, and the other one is involved with creating surfactant, so producing surfactants so the water tension is decreased in your alveoli, so your lungs don't actually collapse. So there are angiotensin 2 receptors on those ones, and that's how coronavirus can actually enter into your cells. But those cells, those ACE2 enzyme receptors aren't just in your lungs. I mean, they're spread out throughout your entire body, and that's probably why we are finding the virus in a bunch of different places as well now. So you see now in the news, most likely, that we'll be finding the virus now in stools, so we can actually test the sewage networks coming out from certain locations to see if there is viruses in the sewage. And it must mean, in other words, that the virus is actually spreading into other cells or other areas of the body where we also have the ACE2 enzyme receptor. Okay, but I'm going too far ahead of myself. Back to the focus now. So you guys get the idea that the virus itself is non-living. Well, let's see it as non-living. Let's leave all of the what do you call it, the controversy around it. It's basically a packet of proteins. This packet of proteins can enter into your cell, and once it enters into your cell, whatever cell this may be, a CD4 cell, whatever cell, doesn't matter. As soon as it enters into the cell, it can start replicating or stealing some of your cell's own functions. So like the ribosomes, or it can start stealing a part of the central dogma. So not stealing the central dogma per se, but the central dogma was where we have DNA is translated, transcribed, and then a protein is made. So it can actually get into that process there and steal some of our own replication or some of our own transcription, translation that would have normally happened, and start making itself instead of our proteins being made by our own cells. So it can hijack it from the nucleus itself, or it can hijack the ribosomal units within your cells directly. At the moment, I'm not 100% sure, but it looks like the COVID is actually hijacking the ribosomal subunits. But we'll get there. Okay, I hope that's making sense. Why is it so extremely difficult to kill viruses? It's very difficult to say kill because they're not really alive, but it really is because they are living inside of our own they are inside our own cells. So how do you actually target something and kill something inside your own cell? So you need, in other words, a drug that can go into wait, hold on. So you need a drug that can go into your own cells and not kill your own cells at the same time as actually just stopping the virus. So all of that sounds simple enough. Is it simple enough? Not at all. I mean, just think about it. How do you actually get a drug to go specifically to those cells and stop your body's own normal functions? Because the virus is hijacking your normal functions. So it's hijacking your ribosome, or it's hijacking a part of your DNA for replication, etc. It's taking over, but it's still part of your body's own functions. So how do we create a drug that can only stop that and nothing else? And also, let's go even before that, before a virus enters into your cell. It usually enters into your cell via a receptor that is normally there. So like your CD4 receptor or your ACE2 receptor, etc. It's via a receptor that's already there. So we can't block those receptors. If we block those receptors, we're blocking normal functions our body needs under normal circumstances. So it'll depend on what receptor it is, what functions you would block, but we can't just willy-nilly block those receptors. And even if we do block those receptors, you would have to block them all the time, because if the virus enters into them the virus can enter into them at any time. So if you have to block that receptor all the time, what will your long-term complications be? And I'm pretty sure there's been probably hundreds of drugs made that block only specific receptors. Most of the time, I don't think there is so much success to it because of all the toxicity that will be related to blocking your body's normal functioning. So there's a lot of challenges for actually treating viruses or stopping viruses. Another thing I want to mention is when we want to test an antibiotic, for example, it's easy. You have a petri dish. The bacteria themselves are living, prokaryotes. They're much more like eukaryotes, like us. So they start replicating by themselves. So 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, etc. They replicate, and then we can easily see what's going on there. Okay, that's no problem. So we can easily see the bacteria is growing. So if we expose the bacteria in the petri dish to an antibiotic, we can see what happens to it. Easy peasy. If it's a human or if it's a virus, we can't just put it in a petri dish. We have to actually put it into a cell. And then if we do put it into the cell, we have to see that the viral replication is stopping in the cell. So already that's much more difficult. And even if you can actually target that cell directly, that is still a human cell, and you still need a drug to actually get to that human cell inside the body. So even outside of the laboratory testing, if you go to a human testing, you might find a completely different story. So all of this really complicates the making of a virus. And of course, viruses are so effective at making more copies of themselves. If you don't stop the complete viral replication process, you have basically achieved nothing. If only a few of the viruses can get through, you'll have resistant ones created faster and faster and faster. So, for an antiviral to be effective, it needs to completely stop viral replication. If we don't completely stop viral replication, you will not effectively stop a virus from actually spreading or um, increasing its numbers. It's so difficult because it's not really a living thing, so it's so difficult to just talk in normal circles, like normal language here. Okay, so what ones are we really after? What are the ones that we are effective in treating? So cytomegalovirus, effective in treating, yes. Hepatitis virus, effective in treating, yes. Herpes viruses, very easy to treat, not a big issue. You guys know everything about HIV virus, I'm not going to go into that. Influenza viruses, the flu, we are effective in treating it. But another thing as well is a lot of it is self-limiting, so it's not the biggest issue in the world. And then coronaviruses, we were effective in treating the older ones. The new one we don't know yet. And we'll go into all of these to some extent today. I think I'll do a lot more coronavirus with you of everything that is available at the moment. And by the moment I mean April 2020. I haven't actually updated myself in May at all, so I can't really tell you exactly what's going on in May. And I don't really see the point because it's going to change again by June, by July, by August. It's going to change the whole time because we really are so unsure about so many things at this point in time. So getting updated is really something that everyone will have to do, and it'll really be one of your more professional expectations going into this new world with this new kind of problem. And I hope that makes sense. Let's just quickly see. Okay, so I think this is basically covered already. I think you guys understand the idea that it has to be inside of our own cells to actually do something. A virus is kind of like a parasite. It feeds on a different cell. It's not a parasite in parasitic terms, like we do have specific things we actually call parasites, and we go over those in the next round. So parasites meaning worms, helmintics. Helmintics is one. Malaria is also a type of parasite. The protozoans. But I mean, to be a parasite doesn't actually mean that you have to fall into that class. To be a parasite, it means to feed on something. So the viruses, in a certain sense, go into our own cells and feed on our cellular processes and hijack it. So most of them use our own enzymes, so they kind of take over our own enzymes. Think about HIV, for example. Now, HIV is a bit different. It had reverse transcriptase in the integrase and protease. So it brings its own enzymes and uses its own enzymes to take over certain processes or to get involved in certain processes within our own cell to start making more of itself. Okay. Certain viruses multiply in the cytoplasm. As far as I understand, this is the case with the coronavirus. Certain viruses actually go into the nucleic acid. So that's an example like HIV. So HIV, remember, it's reverse transcriptase, viral DNA integrated into our own DNA, and from the own DNA we make new viral copies accidentally, and then protease snips them apart, and then you have a bunch of little proteins that can be compacted together, and you can have a mature virus again. Mature virus is just a bunch of proteins once again. It doesn't have a heartbeat, doesn't have lung function. It's actually the most simple organism. Is it even an organism? Yeah, it probably is. But it's actually an extremely simple thing, and its geniusness probably lies in its simplicity, because our body confuses it for something else and takes it up, and then after that happens, it goes crazy inside your body. Difficult to explain in normal terms, but it is insanely genius in its simplicity. So, what are the antivirals that we do use most of the time? So most of the antivirals that we do use at the moment are analogs of purine or of pyrimidine. So what that means is we basically have analogs that look similar to the building blocks of nucleotides and nucleosides, or look similar to nucleotides and nucleosides, and then these are incorporated into the virus when it's making its proteins. That's via our own ribosomes that's hijacked, like coronavirus, or if it's via the viral DNA that's incorporated into our own DNA. So however it is made, if it's in the cytoplasm or intracellularly with the nucleus itself, that function or that protein will not be viable to actually continue its work or continue replication. So if you have a code of 2,900 base pairs, if we have one mistake in that code, it becomes a useless protein. Let's say the protein structure looks like this. One small change can turn the entire structure into this. I know that doesn't make any sense, but proteins are extremely complicated molecules to actually, well, I do have a video on it. I'll show you the video. Hopefully you can understand a little bit more then. But as soon as we change the structure, it might not be able to interact with the next thing or the next receptor, and then it loses its function. And when it loses its function, we hopefully effectively stop the replication. So most of our antivirals are analogs. They basically disturb the building blocks, and by disturbing the building blocks, the eventual DNA or the eventual protein that's created might not be created at all, or will become useless, non-functional. Okay. So when we give an antiviral drug, this is happening. So we are inhibiting the viral replication process, whatever mechanism. As soon as that drug is removed from our bodies, it can just simply start again. So this is another challenge. Outside of antivirals needing to completely stop viral replication, it has to stop viral replication the whole time. So we need to find a drug that has a long enough half-life and easy enough to dose to actually be able to do this. If we have to keep a person on an IV drip the whole time for 2 weeks, it'll be so expensive hospital-wise and no company will fund it. So that's another example of how complicated it is to actually develop a drug that works perfectly. This is also touching a little bit on pharmaceutical chemistry, but I'm not an expert in there at all. At least you guys are suffering with Prof. JJ, so maybe he can tell you guys a little bit more about... Actually, he does use the software to model these things, so he could give you an extremely interesting lecture on the proteins and the viral proteins and how we can actually try to counteract them, etc. Okay, so characteristics of antiviral drugs. So they have to be able to enter our own infected cells. They have to interfere with nucleic acid synthesis. They have some of the drugs can interfere with the virus's ability to bind to our own cells. So that's an example like Maraviroc or Enfuvirtide. I can't think of anything else really now. There's a reason why we've made so much more progress with HIV treatment than anything else. But we'll get into that a little bit just now again. If we haven't already, I think we have already done a lot of it. You guys have done HIV. Okay, but the exact reason why we can go into just now. Of course, as soon as a virus is recognized in the body would mount a huge immune response. So, if the virus is just in our bodies and doing something in there, it doesn't necessarily mean that we mount an immune response to it, because it's still inside of our own cells. So, our bodies can't see the antigen, can't see the virus when it's inside of our own cells. But as soon as that cell becomes different or changed or malfunctions or dies and more virus is released, the body starts perceiving the virus more and more, and we start making immune antibodies. As soon as antibodies bind to the viruses itself, then we get immune responses starting to happen. So in a lot of the cases, the thing that makes you sick isn't the virus itself, but it's your immune reaction towards the virus. And that immune reaction can be deadly, like in coronavirus. Another example for you is like when we have a common cold. Most of the common cold viruses, the coronavirus, rhinoviruses, arboviruses, we have a bunch of different ones. When we have a common cold, those viruses attach in our respiratory, or let's call it the nasoepithelial cells, inside your nose mostly, and down your throat, a bit of your lungs, trachea, maybe a little bit, etc. But think about your nose mostly now. As soon as it starts destroying the cells inside your nose, you start getting this inflammation happening, and that's when your nose starts, when you get rhinorrhea, when you get a runny nose. The actual inflammation itself is not caused by the virus at all. It's your body seeing the virus and starting an immune reaction. So now what your body does is it starts destroying your own cells as well. So your epithelial cells within your nasal cavities are getting destroyed. And with this destruction happening, prostaglandins are released, histamine is released, all of the inflammatory mediators that you guys should know quite a bit about by now are released. And these inflammatory mediators stimulate vasodilation, for example. And with vasodilation, you get your runny nose. So it's your own immune reaction towards the virus that starts this entire process. You'll see a lot in private practice that a lot of doctors prescribe glucocorticoids with an antibiotic It's the worst thing to do ever. But as soon as a person uses glucocorticoids, they will suppress the inflammatory response. So if you suppress the inflammatory response, you won't get your runny nose anymore. So you would seem amazingly fine. Your symptoms are gone. You've been treated. Back at the ranch, you've not been treated. You've just delayed the virus, and you'll just be sick a bit longer. Okay, but I hope that's making sense. So we can also change the body's immune reaction. If we can change the body's immune reaction or manipulate it, we can manipulate the cause of the disease. Okay, of course, yes, the best responses we do have with any person treating for virus or with people with good immune systems. So if your immune system isn't functioning, it's up to us to completely stop that virus from spreading. And just think about coronavirus, for example. In this case, we don't have any antiviral drug that actually is active against it yet. Or we might actually have something already, but we haven't tested it and we don't know yet. So it's completely irrational to just give anything, because antivirals are very specific to very specific diseases. So at the moment, if you don't have a good immune system, you don't have any defense against the coronavirus. Synergistically, yes. And I'm out of breath. 2 seconds. Okay, so back to it. What I wanted to mention with this next section here, we'll see if it's somewhere in there. So antiviral drugs that we do have, so most of it is in HIV, and I'm just now mentioned why. But in HIV, it's not self-limiting. It continually gets worse and worse and worse. And there is, it was a terminal illness back in the day. So I mean, if you had HIV and there was no treatment, you will die. But because it's a lifelong infection, treating it and seeing outcomes and testing it clinically is so much easier. Most other viral infections that we do get are self-limiting. 4 days, 5 days, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. Most of them are self-limiting, and our own immune systems deal with them. HIV was different. HIV could not be dealt with your own immune system. So the amount of research that went into treating HIV was insane. And that's why the HIV is so much better controlled, and we have so many amazing drugs against HIV versus everything else. Everything else, we didn't really need it as badly. With coronavirus now, you do still need it. I mean, but as soon as you can get a vaccine, for example, or you can get some kind of immunity, then you can't really, or you might be able to get it again. But I don't actually know yet. But if you had immunity for 2, 3, 4 years, then that means for that 4 years you were safe. With HIV, if you got HIV, there was nothing you could do. You had no protection at all. You would just be going downhill the whole time. So that's why the amount of research that went into HIV was absolutely enormous. Okay, but with that said, let's go over a few of the ones that we're actually using now. So, you don't actually just get your RNA viruses, you get DNA viruses as well. But I don't really want to go into the big differences there. I don't feel it's so important, but some of it we'll go into. I think you guys should know shingles and chickenpox. I think you guys should know the lesions. I did review in dermatology. So shingles, you get this crusty, it's more like a vesicle, no, what do you call it? Hold on. Little vesicles that form, almost looks like little pimples, that forms on certain areas of your body. And it's normally asymmetrically, meaning one side of your body. And that's normally a reactivation of chickenpox you got when you had some immune suppression for some reason, like an accident or diabetic maybe, or older age, or anything of that sort could give it to you. Herpes virus, you guys should know. Herpes virus, as far as I understand, is a DNA virus. Not 100% sure. But herpes virus is simply, how do we put it, cold sores. I think you guys should all know about that. HIV itself, not going into that again. And then non-retroviral viruses, so meaning they could also be RNA viruses or DNA viruses. Once again, not as important for me to really differentiate between those ones. Influenza viruses, you guys should know. Influenza viruses are basically the ones that give you flu. So flu, like the little bit of an upgrade from the common cold. Flu itself isn't really deadly, but if you have a massive amount of influenza infecting a massive amount of your respiratory cells, you can get this insane cytokine storm, similar to what's happening with the coronavirus at the moment. And this cytokine storm would lead to a lot of complications with dysregulated immune reactions happening, causing different effects after the fact, or after the infection, or while you have the infection. Like the coronavirus at the moment, you get hypercoagulabilities, you get random clotting in your toes, and it's all because of the abnormal immune reaction is now following this massive amount of viruses being released. We will go into the coronavirus a little bit more. I like going into that one more because it is so much more deadly at the moment than influenza. So, and of course, it's so much more important at the moment worldwide. So, I'm gonna go into the coronavirus, the mechanism, etc. later on. Herpes simplex virus, you guys also know. Oh wait, hold on. Did I say what did I say this previous one was? Okay, I know. Herpes simplex virus, herpes. You guys know herpes. Cytomegalovirus is a little bit different. So normally when you are immune compromised, you can get a cytomegalovirus. The range of symptoms you can get from cytomegalovirus is insane. Normally a more opportunistic infection, not something that everyone gets. There's an insane range of symptoms. I will maybe go into that a little bit. Let me just make a note of that, just for interest sake, because there is it's something to behold. It's not something that you often see in South Africa. You might see a few cases here and there, and the way it presents can be so weird and so different. So I'm going into that a little bit just now, maybe, but not too much. Hepatitis, you guys should know as well. Hepatitis is basically a virus that attacks your liver cells directly. You've got A, B, and C. In South Africa, we normally treat it with ARVs. We don't actually treat it with the originally designed drugs for hepatitis. And hepatitis is also another example of a virus that we are actively challenging or actively researching, because it is also a chronic infection that we can't just get rid of. Our bodies can suppress it well, and we can live a nice and long time with it. But unlike influenza, etc., it stays with you. It doesn't leave you. Okay. Oh, and this is important. Just look at the adverse effects here. One of my notes I made here. You get serious side effects with most of the antiviral drugs that we make. And the reason is we are interfering with normal cellular replication, or cellular, the central dogma, making proteins. So some of the proteins that we would be making under normal circumstances would also become non-functional or malfunctioning. And that's what leads to our toxicities we get at the end of the day. So to overcome that and to effectively suppress the virus is a major challenge, and it's extremely difficult tightrope balancing act that needs to happen. And that's why it's so difficult to make the perfect ideal antiviral. And I hope that makes sense. With bacteria, it's easier. The bacteria, there are differences between us and the bacteria, like the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes. We have differences in our ribosomes, for example. We have differences in our mitochondria. Does a bacteria even have a mitochondria? I don't think so. There's another example. So, but because there are obvious differences, there are obvious things to target. But with the virus is using our own body to make more of itself. So we have to, in a certain sense, run the risk of causing a malfunction in our own DNA replication to effectively inhibit the virus, and a lot of the toxicities happen from that. And I'm out of breath again. Maybe Corona got me as well. And to continue, okay, so interesting fact here for you guys, especially now too with the coronavirus, is your host immune response is essentially the most important thing. So when we give an antiviral drug, we are stopping replication from continuing. So we are stopping more virus from being made, but we can't do anything about the virus inside the body that's there. So latent virus that might get stored elsewhere in the body, we can't do anything about. So only replicating viruses we can do something about. Viruses not replicating at the moment, we can't deal with. So when it's outside your body, you can wash your hands. You can sanitize. But when it's inside your body and it's latent, like HIV, it's there. You can't do anything about it. On that point, how do you think those people who are now cured of HIV, okay, they are cured of HIV. I'm doing this, I don't know why I'm doing this. So there are people who are cured from HIV. We have 2 people in the world who have been cured from HIV. How do you think they were actually cured? I know how. I want to see what you guys are thinking, because the method is viable. I mean, the method can work for basically anyone. It's just extremely difficult to actually do it, and extremely expensive. I can't remember what the background story was behind those 2 people who were cured. There was a big background story. I think the one had cancer, and it was part of a transplant. Ooh. Okay, but I'm not going to tell you. I want to see what you guys are thinking, how they were actually cured. Because a lot of people have a conspiracy theory, but HIV was released from a lab. Like the coronavirus was released from the Wuhan lab, but actually, I don't have enough evidence or know how to say which way is the right way, what actually happened, can't say. Anyways, Focus. Back to the topic at hand. So, anyways, clinical efficacy of an antiviral drug will depend on how well it can actually achieve viral replication suppression at an infected cell. So we don't want to affect the other cells. We just want to we want to stop viral replication where the cells have been invaded by the virus. The other cells, we don't want to mess with guanine, and we don't want to mess with the nucleotides and nucleosides that are part of the normal normal central dogma, the normal protein synthesis in our bodies. We don't want to mess with those ones. We want to mess with the viral replication and the nucleosides that the virus is using to make its own copies. We want to mess around with those ones. So inside actively infected cells. We don't want to touch the rest of our body. Because the virus is hijacking our own things, we want to just work with the virus. We don't want to damage the rest of the body. Okay. With that in mind, but I think this you guys already more or less know. So the antivirals, the stages of replication. So we have cell entry, attachment, penetration. So back in an HIV, they would have been attaching to a CD4 receptor, and then co-attaching to a CCR5 or a CXCR4 receptor, and then we have fusion of the membranes, and after fusion we have uncoating of the inside. So the P24 proteins break apart, and the viral capsid is released. Then we have transcription of the viral genome. So it's not exactly the same for HIV there. Transcription of the viral genome might happen inside with the ribosomes. So the virus, the RNA being present inside the cytoplasm might get taken up by our ribosomes, and copies are made from the ribosomes directly. Or we could have reverse transcription like in the case of HIV, and we can make viral DNA, and viral DNA can be incorporated into our own DNA, and then we have transcription from there. So those two can happen. These are all the processes inside the body. Not all viruses work the same, but they work on a very similar principle. And then after we've made all of these proteins, we've translated, transcribed, and we've made a bunch of proteins. These can be compounded or broken apart by proteases, whatever, and then we put these components together and we create a virus, or we accidentally do create a virus. So we actually make the viruses continue its life cycle accidentally. Our bodies does it, so we have no control of it. So we create the virus, and then we release it. So our bodies then releases it. So it could be upon cell death, it could be continually, but eventually if the virus interferes with enough of the normal cellular mechanisms of actually making its own proteins, the cell won't be able to survive anymore, and then we can get cell death as well. So the cell will be killed by the immune system and by the virus, and when cells die, we have a massive release of cytokines, and then we get a massive immune response. We'll go into that at the very end with coronavirus much more. Okay, this is just the same thing again. So you remember for HIV, we have enfuvirtide that blocks the entry of HIV into the cell, so the CD4 receptor cells. Here's an example of amantadine. Amantadine basically blocks the uncoating of the viral capsid in influenza viruses. And then all of these are just examples you guys can work through if you want. Not if you want, but just make sure you understand the idea of how we actually interfere with viruses. I think I've ranted about it today so far. So I think as long as you have a good idea, you'll be able to apply your mind later on when you get confronted with a new virus or antiviral drug. Okay, let's go into the specific ones that we are using, that is working, that is safe, that have clearance to be used anywhere for these indications. So anti-herpetic drugs. You can see it's very similar. Acyclovir, famciclovir, ganiciclovir, foscarnet, but different. And I can't say that word, trifluridine. Generally speaking, in South Africa, we don't dispense so many of these. I have dispensed acyclovir, famciclovir, and ganiciclovir. I haven't actually touched foscarnet, and I can't say that word. So that once again, that's another reason why I'm also going into these ones so drastically, because you won't have so much to do with them, and if you do have to do with them, you will probably have to relook at them. So just examples here, the ones that we use, acyclovir we use for herpes simplex virus 1 and 2, and varicella zoster virus, so that's basically shingles, and shingles is varicella zoster virus. Caniciclovir, Zydofover, cytomegalovirus, famciclovir, genital herpes, and shingles. So I think you guys know what it is. Foscarnet, herpes simplex virus, varicella zoster, cytomegalovirus, HIV. Do we use for Foscarnet and HIV? Ooh, I'm gonna do this. And remember, all of the antiretrovirals are also antiviral drugs. Penicillin, herpes labialis. I think you guys should know what labialis means. And trifluridine herpetic keratoconjunctivitis. So when you have shingles, you can actually get shingles across one side of your face. And if you get shingles across your face, it often infects the cornea itself as well. So you can get this herpetic keratoconjunctivitis, and I'm imagining a trifluoritide is something that's used much more in ophthalmological settings or with an ophthalmologist. So I'm imagining it probably is a drop, and that's what I have there. But dealing with it myself, I haven't had so many opportunities to deal with it myself. So all of the acyclovir, valcyclovir, ganciclovir, all of them are pretty much the same thing. You can look through this just about the bioavailability, but all of them work on the same principles. They are guanine nucleoside analogs. So very similar to our NRTIs that we had with HIV. They interfere with, or as soon as they get incorporated into the viral genome or the viral RNA or viral DNA, there's probably one or the other one inside a disease like herpes. But as soon as they get incorporated, they cause chain termination, or they cause a non-functioning protein to be made at the end. So very similar once again. But this is interesting for me. So when you actually have, let's say this is herpes simplex virus. Let's say when you have herpes, the herpes virus actually brings along this thymidine kinase enzyme. And this thymidine kinase enzyme actually activates acyclovir only in the affected cells. So acyclovir goes to the body, it gets absorbed in all the cells, but it's only activated in the cells that have presence of viral thymidine kinase. So viral thymidine kinase will activate acyclovir, and then it will become a nucleotide analog, and then it will be incorporated into the viral DNA, and the analog will disrupt the chain, or it will make a protein that's non-functional, etc. And then we have non-functioning proteins being created. So we are effectively inhibiting viral replication. Okay. Only replicating viruses are inhibited. Remember, it's the same principle. Viruses already made or made. We can't do anything about them, so we can't fix them. Our immune systems have to deal with them. We can't fix them at all. HIV, for example, if you stop taking your antiretrovirals, you just start making it again. So the virus itself, we can't kill. We can just stop it from making more copies of itself. Active regardless, but with sufficient drug, won't be able to continue replicating. Okay, that's true. Acyclovir does selectively activate. Okay, you got that already. Infected cells do not phosphorylate acyclovir. Unaffected cells, yes. So the unaffected cells do not contain the viral thymidine kinase. Of course, the unaffected cells won't do anything, and you won't actually. Because remember, if you make this nucleotide analog, your body can incorporate it in our own normal processes where we want to create proteins, and then we're creating non-functional proteins. So the less we can actually cause that, the less toxicity it will have. So that's why acyclovir is used so widely, and you will probably dispense it quite a few times in your life, is because it doesn't affect non-affected cells. Only the affected cells are affected by acyclovir. Adverse effects, very boring. The nephrotoxicity one is interesting. So acyclovir is responsible for causing a lot of crystalluria in the world. Crystalluria could lead to a disease called nephrolithiasis. Nephrolithiasis is a fancy word for kidney stones. So acyclovir, ganciclovir, all of them can give you kidney stones. If you have kidney stones, you might pee blood, hematuria, and if you have kidney stones, you have something that we call a post-renal failure, and that might lead to renal insufficiency as well. And then they also cause myelosuppression, so they might become accidentally activated, I'm not sure how, inside of the bone marrow, and we might not be able to make our neutrophils and our platelets. Okay. I think that all that's making sense. It's not too difficult so far. Let's just catch our breath again. Okay, so where were we? We were around here somewhere. We were talking about acyclovir and valcyclovir and famiciclovir, all of these cyclovir drugs. So all of these cyclovir drugs more or less work on the same principle, and that's also the reason why they're not really so toxic. So they only work on cells where we no on infected cells. So in other words, they only work where cells have been exposed to the certain virus, so herpes virus 1, 2, varicella zoster virus, shingles is caused by varicella zoster virus, and there it acts on that. I can't remember the name now, just give me 2 seconds. What was the name of that thing again? Thymidine kinase. So the viral thymidine kinase, it actually comes with the virus, so with the herpes simplex virus or with the varicella zoster virus. So that thymidine kinase actually metabolizes our drug from a prodrug form to a nucleotide analog. So it's only in infected cells where this is actually active. So we save the body from a lot of toxicity here. So under normal circumstances, our DNA gets transcripted and translated and transcribed into the certain proteins, and we then take nucleosides and nucleotides from the cytosol, and we make proteins. So if we were then to actually use a cyclovir, that we would not interfere with this process in all of the other cells. So the toxicity related to a cyclovir is far, far less than other drugs that might be nucleoside or nucleotide analogs. I hope that makes sense. I think I have discussed all of this. Side effect wise, I was mainly just going over this quickly. Crystalluria, meaning that you can actually have crystal precipitation within your urine. If you have crystal precipitation in your urine, that's very close to actually developing kidney stones. So nephrolithiasis is one of the main things here. And if you develop a kidney stone, we call it a post-renal infection, not infection, post-renal failure. So pre-renal failure is blood flow towards the kidney. Intrinsic renal failure means that something went wrong in the tubules itself. And then post-renal failure means that urine can't flow out of the body. So if urine can't flow out of the body, your serum creatinine, for example, will start going up. So if your serum creatinine goes up, that's an easy way to monitor for a cyclovir or ganciclovir, any of these cyclovir drugs toxicity. Okay. So renal insufficiency, I think you understand how to monitor for this since you've been taught with tenofovir. Same idea, same principles apply. Only difference is you might actually pee blood because of the crystals. Anyways, myelosuppression, meaning neutrophils will be less. Neutrophils are less, then your white blood cell count will be decreased. So decreasing your white blood cell could also mean that a cyclovir is causing a toxicity. And thrombocytopenia, meaning that your platelets will be decreased. So I think all of that's kind of straightforward. Monitoring for this drug's toxicity should be straightforward for you. Next drug on the list is cidofovir. So cidofovir is used for cytomegalovirus patients, so patients who are immune compromised and develop cytomegalovirus symptoms. So if you have cytomegalovirus, it's not necessarily that you have all weird array of symptoms. You can have cytomegalovirus and not display big symptoms. But generally speaking, we don't test for some cytomegalovirus initially. It's when we see the patient is just getting worse and worse, and we're not really sure, then we start testing for cytomegalovirus. And how do we test this? This is the very important question. It's very important for you guys to know this going forward as well. So we do basically antibody testing, and we do specific antibodies. So we're testing for a cytomegalovirus antibody in your body. So cytomegalovirus antibody in your body. So what we test for is IgM and IgG, and IgM specifically for cytomegalovirus and IgG specifically for cytomegalovirus as well. If you have an IgM elevation, if you have increased IgM antibodies, that means you have an active infection of cytomegalovirus at this moment. If you have an increase in IgG antibodies, that means you have had cytomegalovirus previously. It could also mean that you still have cytomegalovirus, but it's completely suppressed. If IgM is elevated, in other words, you have an active infection right now. So your body is fighting against it now. The same principle is also the way we're going to be testing for coronavirus. It's going to be the same way we actually would see if a person has had the coronavirus or if they are having the coronavirus now. But the IgM response isn't as fast as the thing we're currently doing for the coronavirus. We're doing PCR testing. So PCR testing, we basically just check the DNA. When we see, it's not just check the DNA, I'm making it more confusing that way. So if you take a swab of someone's nose, we would inadvertently swap some of the virus as well if the virus is present there. So when we completely untangle and destroy all of the membranes around all of the cells, and we just isolate the DNA of our own cells and of the virus, and we sequence that in the PCR testing, we can then see that according to this kilobyte of this sequence here that has exactly these combinations of pairs, ATG, ATG, GTA, something like that, then we know that this must be coronavirus here. And that's why PCR is so accurate, because we look at the DNA itself, or the RNA, or the genetic information, and we can then extrapolate that to this could only be this virus causing this issue here. And that's how PCR works. It's extremely sensitive as well. So it really is the fastest, easiest way to test for it. Whereas, so I mean, you could have an infection and this could be running the whole time, and your body wouldn't have necessarily made antibodies yet. Whereas if you had to wait for the antibody testing, it might have been 2 weeks, 3 weeks before you actually had IgM antibodies and to actually see the infection is there. So that's why the PCR is so much better. But anyways, we do antibody testing in hospital a lot. Some person has unexplained symptoms, we do IgM. Some person has had unexplained symptoms, we do IgG to see if they could have had it previously. I hope that's making sense. And then I was actually ranting on about something else now. Cytofover is also a nucleoside or nucleotide analog of cytosine, so it doesn't need to be phosphorylated, and because it doesn't need to be phosphorylated, it is slightly more toxic as well. So you don't actually have an oral combination of this. This is actually a hospital kind of treatment. So if you have cytomegalovirus that's causing severe disease, you would be hospitalized and treated in hospital with an IV drip of cytofover. Nephrotoxicity, major disadvantage, but you guys already know how to monitor for nephrotoxicity, so I don't worry too much about that. I think you guys are fine. Vidarabine, another nucleoside analog. I think you guys can see where all of this is going. We really try to cause chain termination. If we cause chain termination, then hopefully we don't actually get active viruses being created anymore. Vidarabine, as you can see here, it's only used optically, not optically, what do you call it, topically. So ophthalmic ointment, meaning so we don't actually give it to a person, so it actually goes in systemic circulation. Probably is too toxic. And you can see one of the side effects there, syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone secretion. I can imagine your blood pressure goes sky high if you actually do that. Anyways, so that's probably the reason why we don't actually give it orally or systemically. And some anemia as well. I hope all of this is making sense. I think all of symptoms, all the mechanisms so far really are around nucleoside analogs, being nucleoside analogs and interfering with DNA polymerase, or the making of DNA, or the making of proteins, causing chain termination. So it's actually interfering with viral replication by causing chain termination or inhibiting DNA polymerase or protein synthesis. Protein synthesis is the wrong word, or the creation of various viral proteins. Sounds better that way, definitely. This is a difficult word to say. Trifluridine is a pyrimidine nucleoside analog. So once again, same idea. It's inhibiting viral DNA synthesis. Same idea as all the previous ones. So antiviral spectrum for trifluridine is herpes simplex virus 1 and 2 and varicella zoster virus. Limited to topical. So once again, this one is limited to topical. Used it in cases of herpes simplex virus keratitis and probably also varicella zoster virus keratoconjunctivitis. Yes, that's the one we saw earlier. And another one that works. No, this one doesn't actually work on the same way. Foscarnet, it acts by inhibiting reverse transcriptase, basically. So very similar to what happened in HIV. So if you had an RNA kind of a virus, so a virus like the herpes simplex virus, HIV itself as well also is an RNA virus that undergoes reverse transcription to DNA. Because under normal circumstances, DNA becomes RNA. So if we reverse we're undergoing reverse transcription, we're going backwards. So from RNA to DNA. So, herpes simplex virus 1 and 2, varicella zoster virus, cytomegalovirus, and HIV all work in that same way. So that's probably why it can counteract that. I'm not sure about the effectivity across the board under which one foscarnet would be more effective or less effective. I know in HIV it's not used. Might be to the toxicity, might be that it's not as effective as the other antivirals that we do have. But generally speaking, if we create something against reverse transcriptase, it is quite specific. Alright.
Okay, and last we spoke, we were at foscarnet. So foscarnet basically is very similar to nevirapine and efavirenz. It basically acts on the DNA and RNA polymerase, so it inhibits the virus from creating more DNA or more viruses or more viral DNA from the original viral RNA. So it won't be able to create the viral DNA it needs to incorporate into our own DNA or to go to the ribosome with its own viral RNA and make more proteins it needs for its own replication. So it basically directly inhibits the DNA and RNA polymerase. So very similar to nevirapine and efavirenz inhibiting reverse transcriptase. We also talk about inverse transcriptase, but it's basically the same thing as reverse transcriptase. So it basically inhibits the same thing as nevirapine and efavirenz. For the third time, I'm saying it too much. Where do we use it? Herpes simplex 1 and 2, varicella zoster, shotmegalovirus, and HIV. Do we use it in HIV? No, we don't actually use it in HIV at all. I can't remember the exact reason for it. Might be that it's more toxic because if you're treating herpes simplex virus and varicella zoster virus, it's kind of short term. It's not like HIV. HIV is extremely long, so that might be one of the reasons. Question would be, how could you maybe monitor for toxicity related to foscarnet? You can use the serum potassium, not serum potassium, serum calcium levels. So if you go into hypercalcemia of calcemia, then you know the person is experiencing some toxicity due to foscarnet. Easy way to monitor for it, just look at the calcium levels. Neurotoxicity, maybe this has to do with getting some unexplained nerve pains. So nerve pain might be a neuralgia of some sorts, might be that you have where can you get neuralgia basically anyway? So let's just say unexplained pains. So if the patient starts experiencing some unexplained pains, it might also be because of foscarnet. And nephrotoxicity, I think everyone knows by now how you actually monitor for nephrotoxicity. Okay, then we're moving on to drugs that we use in influenza. And we know we have more than one influenza strand. So we have influenza A and B. I think there's more, but we normally talk about A and B as far as I have it. Drugs of choice, amantadine, remantadine, so those to block the M2 receptor on the influenza virus itself. So when it blocks that receptor, the virus cannot actually uncoat and spill its contents into our own cells. So that's a big bonus there. No contents into your cells can't actually get into your cells and start replicating. So you can actually take it as a prophylaxis as well. And then we have oseltamivir and zanamivir, and these two basically inhibit the virus from leaving a once infected cell. So when it's making its copies and copies and copies, as soon as it wants to leave, there is an enzyme called neuraminidase, and this enzyme is supposed to cleave the virus free from our own cells or from the cell it infected. And as soon as it's clipped this free, it can go out and go infect more cells. So by blocking neuraminidase, it cannot clip itself free from salic acid. Salic acid is something in our own cells that we have that sticks to let's just say the virus itself. I don't know exactly what it sticks to. But if we inhibit the neuraminidase, it can't actually nick that. But wait. It can't break itself free from the salic acid in our own cell membranes, so it can't move on and go infect other cells. So it basically just stops the influenza from maturing correctly. Ribavirin, not gonna mention anything there. Amantadine, so inhibiting the viral uncoating by inhibiting the M2 membrane receptor of the influenza A virus. Remember, influenza A would have this M2 receptor, but it doesn't mean all influenzas have this receptor. So, not effective for influenza B, only effective in influenza A. So, another reason why it's not so amazing. And also, once again, it limits your extent of getting sick with the influenza, but it doesn't completely take care of influenza on its own. So your immune system is still absolutely paramount in getting rid of influenza. Amantadine can help the most severe cases. It's not very effective for everyone. And then we have, I spoke about the neuraminidase inhibitors just now. So they basically just prevent the new made viruses from actually leaving our cells. So they basically just block that neuraminidase enzyme from snipping them loose, or snipping them, yeah, well, loose. That's the word I was looking for. Snipping them loose from our own cells. So remember, when the virus leaves our own cells, basically just exocytosis. And then when that happens, there is some part of it that adheres to salicylic acid in our own cell membranes. And the neuraminidase, one of its own enzymes, comes there and snips it apart so it can travel away and go and infect another cell. So if we inhibit the neuraminidase enzyme in these cells or in these viruses, then they can't snip themselves free. And neuraminidase isn't something that we actually have, so we don't actually cause toxicity for ourselves by this mechanism. So also tamiflu tablets, zanamivir is an inhalation that we use, but I don't think it's very widely used in South Africa. And you would probably only dispense these in extreme circumstances when someone really has severe flu. There are a lot of people who die of flu every year. So for people who are at risk, people with COPD, people with asthma, people with HIV, much more in their cases. Okay, ribavirin, I haven't actually even seen so much in South Africa myself. The same mechanism as most of our antiviral drugs so far, guanosine analog. So once again, an analog of the building blocks. So if we have an analog of the building blocks, then you know that the virus cannot create more and more RNA and more DNA. If it cannot actually create the proteins it needs, well, remember, if you have RNA, you can create proteins you need from the RNA. So if we completely stop proteins from being created, or we incorporate a false nucleoside into the structure, we get chain termination, so we don't actually get effective proteins being developed, or effective viable copies of the viral RNA, viral DNA going forward. So it looks like it has a very broad spectrum. DNA, RNA viruses are susceptible, including influenza, parainfluenza viruses, RSV, Lassa virus. I can't even remember what RSV is. Anemia and jaundice are adverse effects. I think you guys know how to monitor anemia and jaundice by now. You should be fine. Hepatic viral infections. So the ones that we want to really go into here are hepatitis A, B, and C, and the treatment for them. You've already seen lamivudine and imifestabine are one of our main go-to MACs. Tenofovir is also actually. It's tenofovir, lamivudine, and or tenofovir and imifestabine that we use for hepatitis B infections. And that's really the main one we want to focus on. And then we have some interferons. I think, I'm not 100% sure if I'm going to go into the interferons too much. Let me just quickly remember, and then I'll be back in 2 seconds. Okay, anti-hepatitis drugs. Wait, where was I? I was at the interferons. Okay, so the interferons themselves, or basically like our cytokines that we have ourselves. So when we give you an interferon, we are basically giving you a cytokine. So this is a way of modulating our own immune system, so our own immune systems can interfere with the viral replication. So interfering with your own viral, not your own, with the viral replication by actually telling the immune system, dude, there's something wrong here. Please bring everyone you can. So if we, in a sense, activate our own immune systems by using interferon, can you imagine what side effects you would get? Probably side effects like as if you were sick under normal circumstances. So which ones do we have? Alpha, beta, and I can't remember what the Y is. Is it gamma? Anyways, so we do produce things that are very similar to this under normal circumstances. So we are basically giving your body an overload of this so it can identify the virus faster and interfere with the virus's replication faster. The mechanism itself, how exactly it does this, I wouldn't actually ask you all of these. But for interest sake, for interest sake, you can go through them if you, on your own if you want to. One thing that I see that's actually quite interesting here is that we can actually use interferons against Kaposi sarcoma. Because under normal circumstances, you get Kaposi sarcoma because your own body is not able to, or cannot destroy the carcinogenic Kaposi from actually starting. So if you can't, your body can't see it and can't target it and destroy it from growing, then you eventually develop a Kaposi sarcoma, like a real cancerous growth. But it's your own immune system that couldn't see that. So if we could trick your body by giving you cytokines to actually target Kaposi sarcoma, it would make a lot of sense, doesn't it? I mean, you couldn't actually see it previously. Now we are making your body see it by giving you interferons from outside. So interferons, very plain and straightforward, cytokines. So they simply modulate your immune system to recognize viral infections and to interfere with viral replication. That's what I want you to know. All of this, I'm not so much concerned about. Adverse side effects, the one that I want you to look at, the one that I want you to understand is the flu-like symptoms you will get from it, because you are basically giving a person cytokines like you would release under normal circumstances if his immune reaction is aimed towards a virus. Um, some bone marrow toxicities, I'm not sure if you guys can remember, but during your production of your reticulocytes and all of your blood cells, we have a lot of interleukins in there and a lot of tumor necrosis factors in there, etc., that drive the process. So you are actually interfering with the process, and that can lead to, well, granulocytopenia and thrombocytopenia. Neurotoxicity, cardiotoxicity, arrhythmias, and impairment of fertility. And then we have a little list here of what antiviral we want to use, where we want to use it. Once again, we are in South Africa. In South Africa, the most important one for you will remain HIV from now and forward and forward and forward. Most of the other viruses are self-limiting to a big degree. So that's one of the main reasons we're not so worried about it. And now we are finally at SARS. So full disclosure before we go too far, I'm not an expert on SARS at all. So I've taken information and bits and pieces and put it together as far as I can. I know a little bit of it now from reading, well, the appropriate literature. There are some South African guidelines that were released very recently, but they are more around the management of not giving people the infection. So the hand washing, the social distancing, all of the things that we can do to prevent spreading infection. Surrounding the pharmacology, what pharmacological treatments there are out there, we basically still have nothing. So I'm going to discuss the things that we do have, or the things that are theorized or hypothesized to maybe might work, and then go into why and why not maybe, and the trials that have been done. And these trials are kind of old already. We're back in April. I haven't updated myself in the meantime, and things will probably change all the time, and things are probably changing right now. And yeah, it's going to be very difficult to keep up with the coronavirus for the next while. Okay, so why did it happen? I go into this zoonosis a little bit. So basically, it means that a virus is able to jump from one species to another species. And it shouldn't be such a big surprise if you think about it. If you think about how a virus actually, how fast a virus replicates. Like you have about 100 trillion cells, and each one of your cells can give millions of viral cells or viral viruses coming from it. So the speed at which a virus multiplies is just insane. So a random mutation happening to it as it's being replicated isn't too weird. In fact, random mutation is simply a small change in the surface membrane protein. So it can start binding to ACE, the angiotensin conversion enzyme, 2 receptors on some of the pneumocytes that might just become infective. So small change can occur, and that small change that occurs can make a jump between different species. So under normal circumstances, it would bind to a certain protein in an animal's respiratory tract, like a bat, for example, and now a small change, a chance mutation happens, and now it can jump to a human. Or yeah, something of the sort, and then we basically get this spillover. So we basically got coronavirus starting now from animals, and we've gotten it by bad luck. Bad luck is probably the wrong word, but let's keep it bad luck. Let's not make this a religious thing. So yes, that's basically my thought around how exactly it did start. Did it start in a lab? I did see a very interesting article about 2015 about the coronaviruses they were experimenting on in a lab. Could it have gotten out of there? Who knows? At the moment, the most logical and rational explanation is zoonosis, for me at least. We'll see what comes out there. Okay, so what other coronaviruses do we have? And this is the actual scientific name for the class of them. So how do I say this? Orthocoronavirinae viruses. So these four are the ones, these four are the ones that we normally get. So these are the common colds. We've been getting them for years and years and years, and they weren't so serious. They didn't have these massive R naught numbers. I'll talk about the R naught a little bit, but I think you guys already get the R naught just by looking at the news. Um, so these ones we've been getting for years and years, and they've become common cold. So that's what the common cold is. Well, some of it. We have more viruses. There are rhinoviruses out there, arboviruses, adenoviruses, etc., etc., etc. Like I told you guys in the beginning, we only know about 0.1% of all the viruses and bacteria out there. There are many, many, many more left. And then we had the more serious ones. We had MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, SARS, and now we've got SARS-2. So SARS-CoV was the first one, now we've got SARS-CoV-2. So on that note, a lot of the therapies or hypothesized therapies are things that worked in SARS, the initial SARS, and haven't been tested in SARS-2 or COVID-19. So as we are progressing and as we are doing trials, we are seeing what is the reality of things. But a lot of the theory is built on what was effective for SARS-1 or just SARS. And especially hydroxychloroquine, it's basically theorized from the original SARS trials back in 2012 or 2008, I think. I can't remember when SARS was anymore. So it's theorized around the results they got there. But as we're testing it, we're seeing it, that's maybe not going to be work, not the case. And I see my mic is not, just give me 2 seconds.
Okay, so we covered this zoonotic part. I think we stopped around here somewhere. So I told you guys there are four normal cold viruses, or four normal cold type coronaviruses. So colds are caused by a bunch of different viruses. Some of them are coronaviruses. So coronaviruses is nothing new. This version of coronavirus is new. So we had then after that we had more severe forms of the coronavirus. So we had MERS, and then we had SARS, and then we now have SARS-2, SARS-CoV-2. So that's where we're at the moment. We don't have a lot of information about anything SARS-2 related or SARS-CoV-2 related. We've got some information MERS and SARS related. So that information is from the clinical trials done on those diseases back in the day. And a lot of the hypotheses we are making currently against coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, is from the older information on the previous trials in MERS and SARS. So that's where this list kind of comes from. So this list of proposed pharmacotherapies that we could be using. In this list, remdesivir, chloroquine, lopinavir, ritonavir, ribavirin, nitazoxamide, and novemivir. So those are the antiviral drugs, and then we have immunomodulating therapies. But the immunomodulating therapies, I'm not really going to go into. I think you guys have enough drugs this semester as things are, and also, even though if I go into something here, it's still subject to change. So it's not like what I'm teaching you here is alpha and omega. Everything I'm teaching you is subject to change. Okay, so what do we do know about the virus so far is that it has these little spike proteins on the outside, and these spike proteins can stick to ACE2 enzymes on the outer rim of our own cells. And as far as I have it, these are our epithelial cells and our pneumocytes, so our cells within our alveoli and throughout our respiratory tract. That's why you can get it when you breathe it into, well, anywhere in your airways. So when you breathe it in, you have a big chance. I'm not sure exactly how it works if you get it into your eye. Must be some ACE2 receptors there as well. I'm also not sure how it actually is that we poop out some of the viruses, because I told you earlier that a lot of the PCR testing being done at the moment, they also do at sewage sites or sewage drains or sewage, whatever you call those big pipes. And they're actually finding now coronavirus or SARS-CoV-2 in the sewage systems. So I'm not sure how from our airways we actually get the virus spreading everywhere throughout the body. Oh, actually, I do know that part. But I'm not sure how we actually get it to our gastrointestinal system, because I can't imagine ACE2 being working there, but it's also just a guess from my side. But so we probably have ACE2 receptors more places than just our airways. It must be the only explanation in my mind. How else would the virus actually reach so far? Anyways, ranting a little bit, a lot of information, very much unknown. So let's focus on the things that is known at the moment. So what we do know, ACE2, and we know the spike proteins can actually bind to that. So that's one of the areas we're talking at the moment. Our ACE inhibitors that we are using at the moment, our losartan, is completely different. It's not working on the same receptors. Losartan is working on angiotensin receptors, and our ACE enzyme inhibitors are working on ACE1, not ACE2 itself. So not even close. So we're not even close. We don't have any interactions there at the moment. Okay. Anyways, so once it enters the cell, think of it as HIV at the moment, just to make things easier, so it doesn't feel like a complete new thing to study itself. Think of it as undergoing a reverse transcriptase. After transcriptase goes into DNA, in DNA itself, or gets integrated in DNA, makes copies of itself. From the copies, it goes to the ribosomal subunits, and from the ribosomal subunits, it's making a bunch of copies of itself, and the little of the protein change that were made are then snipped apart by protease. Think of it the same way as the HIV virus for the moment. I think that'll make it the easiest for you. And also, as things change, hopefully it won't be that difficult, or it's not that different, so it's not difficult to actually understand the pathological mechanism for you then. So, but at the moment, it's not necessary that it actually does work the same way as HIV, but there is similarities. All viruses have similarities in the way they work. So, generally speaking, they're hijacking some part of the cell and they're making copies of themselves, and until the cell itself dies. And once the cell dies, then a lot of the pathology starts. Kind of. The pathology itself is a bit clearer at the moment, so we can go into a bit more of the pathology surrounding a critical case. Okay, so what we're looking at the moment, we've got, so chloroquine is it's proposed it could stop the virus from entering the cell, endocytosis and exocytosis of the virus. But this comes from a previous trial that was done in SARS. So in SARS, when they gave people chloroquine, this is not the previous SARS. When they gave people chloroquine, it was about after 3 days, as I have it, they had 100% viral suppression. In the trials done so far in this year with SARS-CoV-2, not at all the case. No improvement. So, not working. Donald Trump taking it. He's probably got enough money. It's not a good idea. It's completely irrational. Yes, like you would expect. Anyways, then we have a bunch of protease inhibitors. So the protease inhibitors we'll talk about. We also have lopinavir, ritonavir that we are looking at the moment. Lopinavir, ritonavir, inhibition of protein synthesis. So not inhibiting the protein synthesis, just making the protein change. Coming from the protein synthesis, useless because they have to be cut to the right sizes. Because this thing, all of these little parts here are proteins that are made by our own unsuspecting cells. So that's also one of the proposed therapies. And then we have a lot of very similar to the antivirals, guanine, adenosine, all of those nucleoside analogs that we hope would get incorporated into the virus chain and make it useless before it can actually be integrated into our own DNA. Okay, but once again, a lot of theory. Will it actually work out that way? Not sure. So I think this is in the article as well. I think everyone knows some of the signs and symptoms. So the signs and symptoms that everyone's most concerned with is the fever. 98%. There's a nice pathological reason for that. Coughing, nice pathological reason for that as well. Dyspnea, also nice pathological reason. Myalgia and fatigue. Maybe your immune system is working so hard you don't have energy, but not such an easy explainable pathological reason for that. What they are seeing in the radiological scanning or radiological imaging is this very interesting, where is it, multiple patchy consolidations. Somewhat explainable, and I will go there and try to explain it to you, and lymphopenia. Anyways, interesting for me is in South Africa the mortality rate is about 66% if you reach ICU. So only 1 in 3 people going to the ICU actually exit the ICU once they have SARS-CoV-2. That's what it looks like. Kind of dark to mention it that way. Acute respiratory distress syndrome, acute kidney injury. So these two are also explainable. I'll explain them just now to you guys. Extremely difficult to treat patients in the ICU. Extremely difficult to treat any patient with lung problems. Point blank. Okay, so the therapies are derived from MERS and SARS, like I told you guys previously. Okay, I'm going to go into the pathology a little bit. Just bear with me. Okay, so the current things, or the current understanding is around the ACE2 enzyme receptor. So once the little spike protein binds to the ACE2 receptor, it gets internalized into our cells. What cells are these? Mostly it is our type 2 pneumocytes or our surfactant producing alveolar cells. So within the lungs. It's also that we have a lot of ACE2 receptors throughout the epithelial cells, as far as I understand it. Not 100% clear on this at the moment. And then once this spike protein binds to this ACE2 receptor, it gets endocytosed into the cell, and that's where it can now start producing its own proteins or start its own viral replication life cycle. Okay. One thing that I want to mention, I hope you guys can remember what surfactant does, but surfactant is there to relieve the water surface tension in our lungs. So if we do not have surfactant, our work of breathing is much, much, much higher, and that's exactly what's one of the symptoms and one of the things happening in our patients, in the patients with coronavirus. Okay. It's bringing in its own chymotrypsin-like proteases, so it's bringing in its own proteases, much like HIV as well. So that's also responsible for snipping it apart. I think for now, since we don't actually know the exact mechanism yet, let's go with the mechanism is very similar to HIV's mechanism, and then from there it should be easy to memorize at least, and also to understand what our therapies will be doing. So once again, like all viruses, it's hijacking our alveolar type 2 cells, and then once it does this, just like with our CD4 cells that start declining when we have HIV, these type 2 alveolar cells would also start dying, and as they start dying, these cells would release certain chemokines, and this would be observed by macrophages in the surrounding area. And also, as the virus numbers are increasing, our macrophages would observe this, and the dendritocytes will observe this. All of our immune cells would start observing this, and we would get this massive release of interleukins and different chemokines. So the interleukins, the chemokines I've read so far are 4 and 6. It's definitely more than just 4 and 6. There's a whole array of them. But for now, let's go with what I have read at least, not just imagination. So it seems like interleukin 4 and 6 are the most dominant ones being released, and tumor necrosis factor alpha are being released. So that's the chemokines at the moment that we are concerned about. So when the endothelial cells receive, so there's no endothelial cells throughout your lungs, when they receive this message from the different chemokines, the interleukin 4 and 6 and tumor necrosis factor, different macrophage, different prostaglandins from the inflammatory reaction to seeing the virus and seeing the death of some of alveolar type 2 cells of pneumocytes, type 2 pneumocytes, we get all of the normal inflammatory responses happening. So we get vasodilation happening, vasodilation response to histamine, prostaglandins, etc. So as soon as this starts happening, the endothelial cells dilate. And the endothelial cells dilating and the capillaries dilating around the alveoli would lead to fluid leaking into the interstitial spaces and eventually into the alveoli. So we have a double whammy at the moment. The first one was that we have surfactant not being produced anymore because the surfactant producing cells are dying. So work of breathing is increasing. Now we have fluid leaking into the alveoli as well. So as the fluid is leaking into the alveoli and you don't have surfactant, your work of breathing has increased exponentially. So it's becoming more and more difficult to keep a person breathing. So you've got serious dyspnea going on here. From there, you eventually get the alveolar space completely collapsing. If the alveolar collapses, you should know that we have impaired gas exchange. You can't have gas exchange without your alveoli. So these people start becoming hypoxemic. If you're going hypoxemic, it means you simply don't get enough O2 into your body. So that's at this point we need oxygen and ventilators. So the work of breathing was very high, so we need ventilators to assist with the work of breathing. We also need oxygen with the ventilators to ensure that we get enough oxygen in, because let's say the problem is on this side of my lung and I've lost 10% of my alveoli there. I only have this 90% left. I've lost 50%, I only have 50% left. I need much more oxygen for that little bit of alveoli I do have left to work effectively. And then also, as this part was destroyed, the virus hasn't stopped spreading and making more copies of itself. So we're also losing more and more type 2 alveolar cells throughout our lungs at the whole time. We just might have one area that's more pronounced at the moment, but it's still spreading throughout the areas. We don't have any drugs. We don't have any mechanisms of stopping this. So it's spreading the whole time and collapsing the lung as best as it can. So it's up to our own immune systems to fight this entire pathological process and contain it. So until you can actually contain this process, it's continuing all throughout your lungs. So your lungs are simply put, and after all of this, getting filled with water and collapsing. Okay, out of breath again. Okay, hold on, let's go on. So also, as you have your type 2 alveolar cells dying because of the virus directly, that immune response that it elicits would also bring all the other immune cells to the fray, and that would also start killing other cells indiscriminately, non-discriminately. So it starts killing type 1 and type 2 alveolar cells. So we have our alveoli are getting attacked from all sides. Oh, there it is. Yeah, I did put it in there. So that also leads to the functions reducing even more. We're losing even more of respiratory function or respiratory volume or respiratory. We're losing our gas exchange ability. So we're losing our ability to absorb oxygen from the air. Okay, we already have this in there. I think I've mentioned all of that already. Okay, and of course, as we have a massive amount of these chemokines being released, the chemokines will also spread throughout the body. The capillary permeability is higher. They also diffuse around there. They get spread throughout the bloodstream and they go everywhere. And then, as our body cannot control the inflammation in that certain area, so as our body is stuck, not stuck, as our body is trying to fight the virus off in that area and releasing a bunch of chemokines. A lot of the chemokines and viruses would eventually enter into the bloodstream and start spreading around. So it's simply as we cannot actually control, or your body cannot control the inflammation in the area, you will most likely get viruses leaking into the bloodstream as well. And this would lead to what we call viremia. So it's much like septicemia, or not septicemia per se, bacteremia, meaning the presence of virus in your bloodstream. Okay, and as this happens, and as various immune chemokines enter the bloodstream as well, we get something called systemic inflammatory response syndrome. I'll get into that in just a moment, I think. But anyways, all of these chemokines going into the bloodstream and the virus going into the bloodstream itself leads to a massive inflammatory response. And that we call the cytokine storm. Well, kind of the cytokine storm. Anyways, as all of them enter into the bloodstream, you get more and more immune reaction happening in the bloodstream as well, and eventually you can have so much of the virus that's entering into the bloodstream, and your immune system is seeing this. You get a massive release of chemokines everywhere in the body, and this massive increase in chemokines throughout the body could also now lead to vasodilation happening. So in situations where we have overwhelming infection, like a overwhelming bacterial infection, or like a sepsis, you can also get sepsis from a virus, and you can get sepsis as well from a parasite. As we have these situations, your blood pressure falls dramatically. And if your blood pressure falls dramatically, your blood flow to all of your organs is decreased. And as soon as that happens, you have what we call MODS. You can also have MODS from different reasons, but most of the time, surge and septic shock give you MODS due to blood flow not going anywhere else, or blood flow not being adequate to your liver, your kidneys, etc. And at that point, all of the inflammatory markers start increasing, and your organ function completely starts falling. And that's why MODS actually stands for a multi-organ dysfunction syndrome. And all of this is linked to the overwhelming amount of cytokines being released, because we can't actually get it controlled at the location, at this site where all of this started. Whew. A lot of words there. So that's kind of, I'm trying to simplify some of it here for you. I hope it makes sense. The exact mechanisms, the exact interleukins, all of that, I don't really care so much about now. It might also change as we get a better understanding. But generally speaking, when you have a bacterial infection, a viral infection, any of those infections that become overwhelming, you get the cytokine storm, and eventually you can get systemic inflammatory response syndrome, and you can get septic shock. And at that point, you get multi-organ dysfunction syndrome, and that's where it becomes extremely, extremely dangerous. So also, just to add to this, you don't have enough blood flow going around at this moment because you have this massive inflammatory response, and you already didn't have enough oxygen because your work of breathing is just through the roof, and your gas exchange is falling at a very fast pace as you're losing your type 1 and type 2 alveolar cells. So all in all, it's an absolute terrible combination of symptoms to deal with. Okay, and then we are at the drugs. Let me just get my breath again. Okay, so I've mentioned everything about pathology I wanted to mention. I do have a few videos I also want to share with you guys, but it's not my video, so it's unfortunately things that I can give you links to. It's not things I can actually put on there, especially around the protein and the future of what you can possibly try and design to counteract this protein, or to catch a certain, well, to counteract these proteins. I mean, now the spike protein in the surface. If you can capture the spike protein, or block the spike protein via an antagonist, etc., you might be able to actually stop it from getting endocytosed into our cells. But I'll link a video for that, because I can't actually, it's not my video, so I can't give it to you guys on iConvo, unfortunately. But hopefully some of you can go look at it. Hopefully some of you have some data. And I did see something about nighttime data, so hopefully you are curious enough to go look at it. And then I also have a nice video about the R0 value, and how at the moment South Africa is still quite below the R0 of 2. So how you can actually see as soon as a country is getting outside of that exponential spread. So at the moment we are still in the we're not really in the exponential spread at like the R0 of 2, but the R0 of 2 is always just around the corner. That's the lockdown actually worked very, very well. But I want to show that to you as well. That's also an external link. It's also not my own thing, so I can't give it to you per se. I can actually. Oh, I've got a plan. I'll show it to you just now. So I'll go into the videos afterwards. Perfect. I've got a plan. Didn't think about it earlier. Sorry. Anyways, emerging therapies at the moment. So the first thing we're looking at, the first thing that actually has the most promise, as far as I understand it, and has some good clinical trial data available at the moment, is remdesivir. So remdesivir is much like our NRTIs in HIV. Once again, it's working as an adenosine analog, so it gets incorporated into the viral DNA and causes chain termination. Once again, same as most of our broad spectrum antivirals. So the dosing itself is unsure. The clinical trials is unsure. A lot of it's unsure about this drug. Long-term side effects, unsure. So it's difficult to actually say a lot about the drug. It's difficult to make extrapolations. So remdesivir, I know, is the most promising at the moment, but not for sure, just promising. And what I can actually teach you about it is almost nothing. There's nothing to work with yet. The chloroquine, I can tell you at the very least, I have no idea how the mechanism works. The mechanism doesn't make any sense to me. It's something about increasing intracellular pH, and then by doing that, you inhibit the cell's ability to get endocytosis and exocytosis. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, how could you just change certain cells' pHs, and how do you not change the entire body's pH then? And if you change the entire body's pH, how does it even remain half safe? But it doesn't make sense. So I don't expect you guys to know that mechanism. And I don't expect you to know anything really about it at this moment, because there were amazing evidence for coronavirus 1. They got 100% viral inhibition, or not 99% viral inhibition in the viral replication inhibition in the original SARS virus, but they haven't been able to do the same thing here. So they got this in day 3. So that data there made that. Knowing that we got 99% viral replication inhibition in day 3 for SARS, made the trial, or made this trial, gave the fort for this trial. So in this trial, they included patients, 40 patients on a high dose and 40 patients on a low dose in the ICUs, and they gave it for them. They gave chloroquine for them for 4 days, and after 4 days, they had still not recovered, so they couldn't get 100% viral inhibition. I mean, otherwise they wouldn't have died. If they got 100% viral inhibition, they wouldn't have died, because that extreme immune reaction and that cytokine storm causing a lot of the problems wouldn't have been there if the virus wasn't being made anymore. So it couldn't have been that it actually worked. And then you can see the people with the higher dose died actually, and people with the low dose still died. So it didn't actually work. The only thing you can say here for sure is that the high dose is more dangerous, that's all. And interestingly, they made this recommendation for the high dose based on in vitro studies they did. So the in vitro studies told them that they need a high serum concentration to actually get what they need, the inhibition of viral concentration, of viral replication, and it didn't pan out. So just getting that out to you guys. Do I expect you to know that? Not at all. Just to understand some of it maybe, and also I'm future proofing you hopefully for whatever comes in the future coronavirus wise, and things will change. So it has a half-life of 50 days, so that also means that we can get extremely super therapeutic levels, and you can see that it causes QT prolongation, and you can see the people in the high dose actually died more, and a lot of that is circumspect to the supratherapeutic levels. So the toxicity is related to it. And then we get hypoglycemia in diabetic patients, and these are things we've known for years, because it's something that we did use a long time ago for malaria. We don't really use it anymore because there's so much resistance from malaria side. So we can get torsade pointers from it. We can get QTC pronation, which is torsade pointer, or it's a form of torsade pointer. Severe cardiomyopathy and neuropathy from it. We have a lot of drug-drug interactions because it does induce the cytochrome D2D6 enzyme, so it will have an interaction with efavirenz as well, and. So all in all, not very promising. Then we have lopinavir and ritonavir, and the idea is that it inhibits that chymotrypsin-like proteases of coronavirus. Um, where did I read? I can't remember now. Hold on. So far, in vitro, not in vitro humans cells completely lacking viral replication inhibition. There was a case series. So the case series did have some evidence that it actually worked, but the case series is just too small, so you need a much larger number to actually generate sufficient data. But it looks like it could be a possibility. I'm not saying it actually works, it looks like a possibility. Then we have ribavirin, and as far as I have it with ribavirin, one of the reasons why we never continued using it is because it is so extremely toxic. So it caused anemia in 49% of all patients who used it, and it caused hemolysis in 76% of all patients who used it. So it's kind of red blood cell toxic, if you can put it that way. So it was destroying red blood cells left and right, and that's one of the reasons I'm imagining why we didn't continue using it. And it's teratogenic. Even the sperm is considered teratogenic if you use ribavirin. Once again, nucleoside analog, much like our NRTIs once again. Then we have nitazosamide. Nitazosamide inhibits the electron transport chain and then basically kills the organism that way. But that doesn't make any sense with the virus, because the virus itself doesn't have its own electron transport chain. So I'm not sure what the mechanism actually would be, or the proposed mechanism would be in SARS-CoV-2, but it can't be that it inhibits the electron transport chain. So, there was accidental, so it wasn't specifically studied. Thank God, because I mean it doesn't make any sense to use it, because inhibiting electron transport chain, if it doesn't exist, makes zero sense. So it was accidentally that they included 5 of these patients, and interestingly, um, results were not promising. Why am I even including this then? Okay, because it doesn't make sense to try and use it. And I think we have nalvinavir as well. Nalvinavir also has an extremely long half-life, and one of the things here is that it can give you an AKI. Um, so why I'm mentioning that specifically is if you have multi-organ dysfunction syndrome, you also most likely have an acute kidney injury. So this could also then lead to an even longer half-life, and it already has a long half-life. So all of that could lead to more problems at the end of the day. And I'm not sure if this was actually for the previous slide. But yeah, I'm not going to ask you questions around those drugs per se. About the immunotherapy, I really don't have the immunotherapy in here at all. I think it's too complicated to go over that now. But I want you to know about it. I want you to know about the cytokine storm. And the cytokine storm is leading to most of the problems and most of the death in the ICUs. So you can now ask me, why don't we just use glucocorticoids then? Because glucocorticoids inhibit those interleukins that you mentioned earlier and the tumor necrosis factor. It does. So in pharmacology wise, it makes sense that it would work, but clinically when we use it, it doesn't actually work. Same goes for using glucocorticoids in bacterial pneumonia and TB. I think actually it works in TB. But in bacterial pneumonia, it makes sense that it should work because it also counteracts the cytokine storm that leads to sepsis. But it doesn't actually give you any improved outcomes. So pharmacologically, should work, makes sense. Clinically, does it actually work? No. So same thing here. Pharmacologically, there are a lot of these drugs based on a mechanism that should work. Would they actually work at the end of the day? Don't know. You have to actually do a trial first and see. The proposed mechanism of chloroquine, for example, inhibiting endostasis and exostasis sounds brilliant, but does it work? No. So just to put it out there for you, even if the pharmacology side of it makes complete sense and the mechanism makes sense, clinically in practice, does it work? Does it reach the area? Does it actually do what we thought it would do? Not always. So that's why pharmacology and the clinical pharmacy side are kind of married and kind of not married. Anyways, I think I've mentioned everything I want to mention. I will upload those articles for you guys anyway, so you can look through it. Hopefully you find it interesting, and then hopefully we know more about the virus later on, and hopefully we can give you more up-to-date information and more useful information before you actually leave university. And one more thing, I'm going to upload the guidelines as well around the social distancing and all of that as well. But I mean, at this moment, it feels like it's common knowledge, so I'm not so concerned about that as well. Okay. Okay, so before I completely leave, these are the things that I wanted to show you guys. I just want to give you a quick idea here. So this was an interesting one for me because it's basically the amount of confirmed cases we have in the past week and the amount of total cases confirmed. So this is nice because you're seeing the exponential increase here as this line. So as long as the country is running along this line, it means that there's an exponential increase. In other words, you've reached your R naught of 2. So if I quickly remove all of the countries, I want to deselect it quickly, just for interest sake. Once again, not my site, not my, nothing of doesn't belong to me, but I found it extremely interesting. It's if I share it, I mean, it's at least you guys can go have a look at it. I think it's a nice way of seeing where we are. So you can see since the lockdown started around there somewhere, not 100%, but it's around there somewhere. We haven't had that exponential increase. We still have quite a big increase, but it's not at twice the doubling time or 2-day doubling time. Our doubling time apparently is something between 8 and 12 days at the moment. I think, could be wrong. So we are not at that exponential increase here. So if we have a 2-day doubling, it means that we have an R naught of about 2. So that's something interesting to go look at. Let me give you a country that's been very bad. Just food for thought. Here's the US. You can see the US. They've started changing some things now, but look, they've been on that line the whole time. Actually, if we play this, let's see if we just play this quickly. So the US had it first. I mean, there they go. They're on that line, and they've completely lifted off. And we implemented the lockdown way earlier, and you can see what's been happening to them and what's been happening to us is not the same at all. So interesting. I'm imagining now as we are easing the restrictions, we'll probably go closer to that again. Anyways, you can go have a look at that. That's interesting. I watched this video on simulating an epidemic, and I think it's an amazing job they did with creating this video. It's so insanely
I want to
interesting.
share with you a few simulations.
You probably can't hear me. You probably can't hear me if this thing is actually playing. But definitely, if you want to watch something interesting on how an epidemic spreads, go look at this video. It's insanely impressive what they actually did, and it seems like they used mathematical models that make sense. Not my area, not an epidemiologist at all, but something interesting to go look at. And then, like I mentioned to you guys earlier about the spike protein, so possible therapies in the future for inhibiting the spike protein attaching to the ACE2 receptor would probably come from here. And this is much more pharmaceutical chemistry side. We're actually thinking about possible things to do here, running simulations on these programs and trying to figure out what we can do to inhibit or to break down these proteins. Yes, not pharmacology per se, but definitely something interesting to go look through as well, especially if you like your pharmaceutical chemistry. On that note, I think I've showed you what I wanted to show you. The rest of it, yeah, that's it for now. And next week we then have our last version or our last week of work, and that's going to be around parasites. So I'm going to go through the antihelmintics, going to go through malaria, and.